Imagine you are standing on a beach. The sky behind you is the pale grey of early morning, and the ocean in front of you, stretching as far as your eyes can possibly see, is not empty. It is filled. Over 900 ships sit on that water, so many that the horizon disappears behind masts and sails. They carry 30,000 of the most battle-tested soldiers the world had ever assembled. Soldiers who have already toppled dynasties, leveled cities, and broken every army that stood in their path across continents. And you? You have 80 men. 80? This is not mythology. This is not a number inflated by centuries of retelling. This is what happened on the island of Tsushima in October of 1274, when a tiny garrison of samurai stood between the full overwhelming force of the Mongol Empire and the heart of Japan. Today, we are going to talk about what really happened that day. Not the romanticized version. Not the version that gets sanitized for school textbooks or softened into legend. The brutal, bloody, historically documented truth of one of the most remarkable last stands any military force has ever made anywhere in human history. Stay with me, because this story is far more complicated, far more devastating, and far more consequential than most people have ever been told. To understand what happened at Tsushima, you first need to understand what the Mongol Empire actually was in the year 1274, because the scale of it is almost incomprehensible from a modern vantage point. By this moment in history, the Mongols had already conquered more contiguous land than any military force before or since. They had torn through northern China, annihilated entire dynasties, swept across Central Asia with speed that no military of the era could respond to in time, crushed the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, one of the greatest centers of civilization on earth, and pushed deep into Eastern Europe, reaching Poland and Hungary before pulling back by choice, not by defeat. All of this within roughly 60 years. Cities that resisted them were not just conquered, they were removed from the map. Populations that fought back were, in many documented cases, simply erased. This was the empire that looked at Japan and decided it was time. The man driving the invasion was Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, ruler of the Yuan dynasty in China, and at this point the most powerful single individual on the planet. Kublai Khan had already absorbed Korea under his dominion after years of brutal, grinding warfare, and Japan, wealthy, strategically positioned, and fiercely independent, was his next strategic target. He had sent formal diplomatic missions to the Japanese imperial court demanding submission and tribute. The Japanese court, operating through its own complex political structure with the shogunate effectively controlling military decisions, had ignored him repeatedly, deliberately. To Kublai Khan, this was not just a political inconvenience. It was a direct challenge to his authority, the kind of defiance that, in the history of the Mongol Empire, reliably produced a catastrophic military response. So, he assembled a force, 900 ships, an estimated 30,000 soldiers drawn from across his empire, Mongol cavalry warriors, experienced Chinese infantry from the conquered Jin and Song territories, and Korean conscripts pressed into service after Korea's own defeat. They carried weapons and tactics that Japan had genuinely never encountered. Gunpowder bombs, iron shells packed with explosive material and shrapnel that could be launched through the air and detonated on impact. and disciplined unit formations built around massed ranged fire rather than individual combat. This was not a raid designed to take plunder and leave. This was a full-scale invasion force built to break Japan open permanently and bring it under Mongol rule. Their first stop, by geographic necessity, was Tsushima. Tsushima sits in the Korea Strait, roughly halfway between the Korean peninsula and the Japanese island of Kyushu. It is actually two main islands separated by a shallow, narrow strait, and its position makes it completely unavoidable for any naval force moving from Korea toward Japan. There is no route around it that is strategically viable. When you are commanding a fleet of 900 ships, if you are invading Japan from the Korean coast, you take Tsushima first. It is simply geography. In 1274, the island was administered by the So clan, a regional lord family whose domain included responsibility for this exposed border territory. The military commander stationed there was a man named Sosukakuni. He was not a legendary warrior. He was not a celebrated hero known across Japan. He was a regional administrator and garrison commander doing what was, under normal circumstances, a relatively unremarkable job on a relatively quiet island when the Mongol fleet was spotted approaching. So Sukakuni had a clear-eyed understanding of his situation. Historical records, and we do have Japanese records that describe these events, indicate he mustered his available fighting force. The number historians most commonly cite, drawing from those records, is approximately 80 mounted samurai. Some scholars argue the total number of defenders may have been modestly higher, when including foot soldiers and armed retainers from the local population. But the mounted samurai, the trained warrior class who would form the fighting core of any defense, numbered around 80 against 30,000. Before anything else, so Sukakuni did one thing that would prove more strategically important than anything that happened on the battlefield that day. He dispatched a warning rider southward toward Dazaifu, the administrative and military headquarters overseeing the defense of Kyushu, to report that the Mongol invasion had arrived and was landing on Tsushima. That message, sent in those final hours before the fighting began, would travel ahead of the invasion fleet and give the Japanese mainland something they desperately needed: time to prepare. Then Sukakuni turned to face what was coming. On the 5th of October, 1274, the Mongol fleet made landfall at Komoda Beach on Tsushima. What unfolded next was not a battle in any sense that the samurai would have recognized. It was a collision between two entirely different philosophies of warfare, and one of those philosophies was about to encounter something it had never been designed to face. Samurai combat in 13th century Japan was, to a meaningful degree, ceremonial in its structure. A warrior of standing was expected to announce himself before an engagement, to declare his lineage, his name, his notable deeds, and then engage in direct, individual combat against a worthy opponent. The code was not merely cultural decoration. It was the framework through which honor was established, maintained, and demonstrated. How you fought mattered as much as whether you won. The Mongols had no framework remotely like this. They had spent generations refining a system of warfare built entirely around efficiency and mass effect. Their archers did not operate individually. They operated in coordinated units, releasing thousands of arrows simultaneously on a single command, turning the air in front of an advancing enemy into a wall of incoming projectiles. Their cavalry tactics were developed not for individual glory, but for maximum disruption to enemy formations, and their gunpowder weapons, the iron bomb shells that exploded in clouds of fire and metal fragments, were something no Japanese warrior had ever seen or heard in their life. Japanese war horses, which had never been exposed to the sound of explosive detonations, panicked when the bombs went off. Riders who had trained their entire lives for controlled, honorable combat suddenly found themselves on terrified animals in the middle of a chaos. They had no framework to process, so Sukakuni reportedly led a charge directly into the Mongol landing force. He and his 80 men rode out onto that beach and drove straight toward an army of 30,000. The Japanese records describe this engagement with unflinching clarity. The samurai fought with extraordinary individual ferocity. Warriors cut down multiple opponents. Men who were struck with arrows continued fighting. The combat was not a rout in the traditional sense. It was a genuine fight in which the defenders inflicted real casualties on the invaders. But ferocity is not arithmetic. Courage does not change ratios. 80 cannot hold back 30,000, regardless of skill, regardless of will, regardless of how fiercely each individual warrior fights. So Sukakuni died on that beach. His samurai died on that beach. The Mongols swept through the island in the days that followed, and the accounts of what happened to the civilian population of Tsushima are deeply disturbing. Korean sources written by participants in the invasion describe massacres of non-combatants. Prisoners were taken, executed, or enslaved. The island was systematically ravaged. Tsushima was gone. After Tsushima, the fleet moved to Iki Island, the next stepping stone toward Kyushu. The garrison commander there, Taira no Kogataka, faced the same impossible equation. The records suggest he and his defenders fought with comparable determination. The result was the same. Iki fell. Then the main Mongol force reached Kyushu and began landing operations near Hokkaido Bay, in the area of what is now Fukuoka City. And here, something shifted, because the warning from Tsushima had arrived. Samurai forces from across Kyushu had converged on the bay. The Japanese were not perfectly prepared. They were still scrambling, still outnumbered, still facing weapons and tactics they had no experience with. But they were there. They were organized. They were fighting on home ground. The battle at Hokkaido Bay was brutal and extended across most of a day. The Mongols pushed inland, but the Japanese adapted in real time in ways that demonstrated genuine tactical intelligence. They stopped attempting individual challenges and began fighting in coordinated groups. They targeted Mongol officers deliberately, recognizing that disrupting the command structure could unravel the enemy's coordinated unique tactics. They used the terrain, narrow approaches, rice paddies, coastal geography to limit the space in which Mongol numerical and cavalry superiority could fully express itself. By nightfall, the Mongol commanders made the decision to pull back to the ships. The reasons historians cite for this decision vary. Some argue it was a precautionary move against a Japanese night attack. Some point to higher than expected casualties among officers. Some suggest supply concerns, particularly arrow supplies that had been heavily depleted during the day's fighting. Whatever the specific reasoning, the decision was made. The army would re-embark. Then the storm hit. A severe typhoon struck Hokkaido Bay during the night, catching the fleet while it sat anchored offshore. The damage was catastrophic. Hundreds of ships were wrecked, capsized, or driven onto shore. Soldiers who had survived a full day of brutal combat drowned in the dark. The organized, disciplined invasion force that had systematically reduced Tsushima and Iki and pushed through. Hakata Bay was reduced to wreckage in a matter of hours. The Japanese called it kamikaze, the divine wind. The idea that heaven itself had intervened to protect Japan became one of the most enduring and powerful pieces of national mythology the country has ever produced. This is the point where we need to be careful and precise, because the kamikaze narrative, as compelling and deeply rooted as it is, has a tendency to absorb everything around it, including the actions of Sosukakuni and his 80 samurai, reduce them to a symbolic prologue before the miracle. That reduction is a mistake. Those 80 men were not symbols. They were not a footnote. Their actions had direct, traceable, military and strategic consequences. The warning they sent south gave Kyushu days of preparation time. In 13th century Japan, where there was no system for rapidly mobilizing forces across a region, days of advance warning was an enormous operational advantage. The difference between the Mongols landing at an empty, undefended Hakata beach and landing at a beach where samurai forces had already assembled. The difference is directly traceable to the message Sosukakuni dispatched before he rode out to die. Furthermore, the cumulative resistance the Mongols encountered across Tsushima, Iki, and Hakata imposed real costs on the invasion force. Officers were killed. Men were wounded. Arrow supplies were consumed far faster than an enemy that simply collapsed would have required. By the time the Mongol commanders made the decision to re-embark their forces at Hakata, their army was measurably more depleted than Kublai Khan had projected. It would be at that stage of the campaign. The storm finished them, but the samurai had already hurt them. Kublai Khan was not a man who accepted setbacks as conclusions. In 1281, he sent another invasion. This one vastly larger, estimated between 100,000 and 140,000 soldiers across two coordinated fleets approaching from different directions. Simultaneously, Tsushima fell again, Iki fell again. But Japan had used the 7 years between invasions to prepare on a scale. The first invasion had made urgent and necessary. A long stone defensive wall had been constructed along Hakata Bay, neutralizing much of the Mongol cavalry advantage at the primary landing zone. Japanese forces used small, fast attack boats to raid the anchored fleet at night, killing commanders and disrupting coordination between the two approaching armies. The fighting stretched over weeks rather than days. Then, again, a typhoon. Historians who have studied the meteorological and archaeological records believe the 1281 storm may have been even more powerful than the one in 1274. The second invasion fleet was obliterated. Tens of thousands drowned. Survivors who made it to shore were killed or captured in the days that followed. Japan held. For the second time, the significance of these two failed invasions extends well beyond Japan's borders. These were, by most historical assessments, the only major failures of Mongol naval power projection in this entire era. A successful Mongol conquest of Japan would have fundamentally reshaped the trajectory of East Asian civilization, the culture, the trade networks, the political structures, the very character of the Pacific world for centuries to come. The men who died on Tsushima could not have known any of that. They did not know a storm was coming. They did not know the invasion would ultimately fail. They had no way of knowing that the warning they sent south would make any real difference at all. They rode out onto that beach knowing one thing with absolute clarity. An overwhelming force was coming. They were samurai, and this was their island. Before we close, I want to step back from the strategy and the numbers and hold for a moment on the simple human reality of what happened on Komoda Beach that morning. So Sugakuni was not a celebrated hero in his own time. He was not the subject of epic poetry or grand military reputation across Japan. He was a regional commander on a border island that most people in the capital would not have been able to locate on a map with great confidence. His posting was not prestigious. It was exposed and underfunded and largely overlooked, right up until the moment 900 ships appeared on the horizon. When that fleet appeared, he had real options. He could have retreated inland and bought personal time. He could have attempted a negotiated surrender. He could have hidden in the interior and waited for the Mongols to move through toward Kyushu. The historical record gives us absolutely no indication that he considered any of these paths for even a moment. He sent his warning. He gathered his 80 men, and he rode toward the largest invasion fleet Japan had ever seen or would see for centuries. That is not the behavior of someone who believed he might survive. That is the behavior of someone who had decided, with complete internal clarity, what his duty required, and who discharged that duty in full knowledge of exactly where it ended. You can debate samurai mythology. You can interrogate the culture, the romanticization, the way it has been packaged and reimagined and commercialized across the centuries since. All of that is legitimate and worth doing. But in that specific moment on that specific beach, a man made a decision with full information about what that decision would cost him, and he made it anyway. That deserves to be seen clearly for what it was. Not a legend, not a symbol fashioned after the fact, a choice, freely made. The Battle of Tsushima is sometimes treated as a prelude, a tragic but ultimately marginal episode before the main events at Hakata Bay and the Divine Wind that ended the invasion. I hope by now you can see exactly why that framing fails. 80 men bought Japan time it did not know it needed. They sent a warning that reached the mainland before the Mongols did. They imposed real costs on the most powerful invasion force of their era. They fought with every tool available to them against odds that were simply, mathematically unsurvivable. And they fought with everything they had until there was nothing left. History has many famous last stands: Thermopylae, Masada, the Alamo, Rorke's Drift. Tsushima belongs in that conversation, not because the defenders won, because they did not, but because what they chose to do and what that choice set in motion shaped the history of an entire civilization. If you learned something today, something real, something that changes how you understand this story, please consider liking and subscribing. Every week we go looking for the moments that actually shaped history, the ones that happened in the margins, in the places most people never think to look, told as close to the truth as the historical record allows. I will see you in the next one.